Happy Easter, guys. Welcome to Fed by Fire. I'm Christian Whitlow. Guys, before we get started, a quick disclaimer. I just want to say, I'm not a military expert. I'm not a former soldier. I'm just a guy who saw this story and thought it was very interesting. And I have a huge amount of respect for people who have served and made that kind of sacrifice. So, this isn't coming from a place of criticism. This is just me trying to understand a bigger picture along with you guys. And what happens when some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world leave war and don't actually leave that life behind. Because over the past week, reports have surfaced about former elite military operatives being accused of running a private killing unit, allegedly generating around $1.5 million a month. While the exact identities and charges are still developing, the structure being described is very clear. This isn't random violence. This is organized, this is systematic, and more importantly, this fits into a pattern that has existed for decades. So, here's what's being reported. A group made up of former Special Forces operatives, personnel, individuals with backgrounds in high-level military units trained in things like surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, and coordinated operations. They are accused of organizing targeted hits for clients, and when you hear that number, 1.5 million per month, it gets serious. It immediately tells you this is not freelance crime, this is a business model. And businesses at that level don't exist without serious financial backing. And when you start asking who funds operations like this, history gives you some very clear examples, because this isn't the first time we've seen highly trained soldiers move into, the private force. One of the most well-known cases is Blackwater. Founded in 1997 by Erik Prince, a former Navy SEAL. You might have seen the Vlad episode. He heavily involved in the U.S. operations during the Iraq War starting in 2003. At its peak, Blackwater had thousands of contractors deployed and was earning hundreds of millions of dollars. And, it was all in government contracts. And when the situation escalated globally after the Niser Square massacre, on September 16, 2007, when Blackwater contractors killed 17 Iraqi civilians, an event that exposed, what happens when private force operates with limited oversight. And even after that, Blackwater didn't disappear. It just rebranded multiple times. First as XE Services and later as Academy, continuing operations under different structures. And, this model didn't stay limited to the United States. In Russia, you saw the rise of the Wagner Group as well. Founded around 2014 and linked to, I can't pronounce that name, which operated in the Ukraine, same thing, Ukraine, Syria, and across parts of Africa, often advancing states' interest while technically existing outside of official military structures. And by 2023, Wagner estimated to have tens of thousands of fighters. Before internal conflict with the Russian government led to, the main guy's death in a plane crash in August 2023. So when you look at what's being reported now, the idea of a private unit made up of former elite soldiers conducting operations for money, it's not new. What's different is how decentralized and accessible it's becoming, because you no longer need a massive organization with, government contracts to run something like this. A small network of highly trained individuals can replicate the same capabilities on a smaller scale. And, that brings it back to the pipeline, because these individuals didn't just appear, they were trained through years of military structure, funded by governments, shaped through real-world conflict in places like Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 2 decades, especially during the peak years between 2001 and 2004, when Special Operations Forces expanded significantly as part of a counterterrorism strategy, allegedly. During that time, the units like the Navy SEALs, the Army Special Forces, and other elite groups were conducting high-frequency operations globally, building expertise in intelligence, gathering surveillance, and, targeted strikes. And then, as deployment slowed and the contracts ended, thousands of highly trained individuals transitioned out of that system. But, the skill set didn't disappear. And, that creates a gap, because civilian life doesn't offer many legal pathways where those exact skills translate at the same level, financially or psychology, But at the same time, there are individuals and organizations around the world with the money and the motivation to use these skills outside of the legal systems. And that's where the overlap happens. And, this is what people are talking about when they refer to the privatization of violence, a shift that has been accelerating since the early 2000s, where force is no longer controlled excessively by nation states. It becomes something that can be contracted, outsourced, and, deniably deployed. And this isn't limited to war zones. Reports over the past decade have shown how private contractors involved in everything from, security operations to targeted enforcement into politically unstable regions, particularly in parts of Africa and the Middle East, especially where resource conflicts and political instability create demand for off-the-books force. So the real question with, the current case isn't just whether these specific individuals are guilty. That's going to be decided through investigations in courts. And the real question is, how many similar operations exist that never get exposed? How many networks are operating quietly, doing the same thing with funding that never gets traced publicly? Because once, violence becomes something that, can be purchased, power shifts, and it no longer belongs strictly to the government or militaries. It belongs to whoever has the resources to access it, and that creates a system where influence can be enforced without accountability. And, that leads to what this actually means at a bigger level. This isn't just about a group, of former soldiers. It's about a shift in how control works in the modern world. For most of history, the force was centralized. Governments had armies, and those armies were supposed to be the primary source of organized violence. But over time, especially in the last few decades, it's changed up a lot and has started to diffuse. And the private contractors, the private security firms, and now smaller networks of these highly trained men, can operate in ways that used to require entire institutions. That creates a situation where accountability becomes harder to track, because when something is done by a state military, there's a chain of command, oversight, public pressure, and legal frameworks. But when something is outsourced or privatized, the responsibility becomes blurred. And when responsibility is blurred, consequences often follow the path of least resistance. So, what you end up with is a world where power can be decentralized, violence can be outsourced, and accountability can be fragmented. And, that combination changes the incentives behind how conflicts, enforcement, and even influence are handled. It also explains why individuals with highly specialized training don't always reintegrate into civilian systems, in predictable ways, because the value of their skill set doesn't disappear, it just changes. The context, and depending on circumstances, that skill set can be applied in legal frameworks or outside them. So when you step back and look at this story, it's not just an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern where training, demand, money, and global instability all intersect. And that's what it really comes down to. Not just a group of former soldiers allegedly running a $1.5 million per month operation, but a system that has been evolving for decades, where war creates highly specialized skill sets and the global economy finds ways to use them long after the war is over. If you've been watching Fed by Fire, that's the focus, not just what happened, but why it keeps happening. Because as long as there's a demand for power without accountability, there will always be a supply of people trained to deliver that. And understanding that system is the only way to really understand stories like this, when they show up in the headlines. Thanks, guys. I'll catch you on the next one.